I'm pleased to introduce our very first ImpacTalks speaker. Marisa Bono was a lifelong social justice advocate and thought leader before she joined Every Texan this year as the first woman of color as the executive director of that organization. She is a licensed attorney and has specific policy expertise in social equity as it relates to education, immigration, voting rights, and political access. Before coming to Every Texan, she served as the chief policy officer to San Antonio's mayor and the chief strategic officer at Via Metropolitan Transit in San Antonio, where she successfully led an initiative to expand service for working families and low-wage workers. Earlier in her career, she served as the Southwest Regional Counsel for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, the nation's premier Latino civil rights law firm. Please join me in welcoming Marisa Bono to the stage.
These are the Benedictine sisters of Boerne, Texas. They're cute, right? The sisters founded Every Texan, former the Center of Public Policy Priorities, or CPPP, back in 1985. You see, the sisters ran a hospital, and they were sick and tired of seeing their patients, mostly low-income families from Texas, get the short end of the stick. They saw a system that perpetuated an inequitable access to healthcare across the state. They saw firsthand our state's unfortunate legacy in which Black, Brown, and other Texans of color simply did not have a fair opportunity to prosper in life. And so, the sisters, like so many other great women trailblazers in our state, decided to take matters into their own hands. They made a plan. They knew that in order to change the system, they had to change the law. And so they founded a public policy advocacy organization to demand that state lawmakers put people first in their policymaking. It was pretty cheeky of them. We come from troublemakers, good trouble. And so CPPP is who we were. We grew, we expanded our scope, and to healthcare, we added education, food security, fair taxation. We cultivated some of the best experts in the state, if not the country. We grew our reputation as the preeminent progressive think tank in the state. We were policy wonks with a heart. We were keyboard and backroom warriors, and that's who we were for many, many years. But over the years, we began to realize that we were losing ground. Texas remained steadfastly red, and regressive social and fiscal policies proliferated across the state. And we realized that research and data were no longer enough, that telling a compelling case with numbers was no longer enough. Hell, that the truth wasn't no longer enough. And so we realized that we had to expand our advocacy, and as part of that, we embarked on a comprehensive rebrand. And we did all the things that you think of when you think of a rebrand. We hired a fancy consulting firm, we engaged our staff and our board, we looked for survey information through interviews. We got a beautiful new website, some new collateral, stationery. We chose a new name, Every Texan, a new logo, and a powerful new credo. Social justice requires public policy. And so on the surface of it, you would think that once we did all those things and then reintroduced ourselves to the public, we were done. Rebrand over, right? Wrong. Today, I want to challenge you to rethink, as I did, what a rebrand can mean for an organization. It's an opportunity for growth and for evolution. But in order to understand those things, you have to be willing to look behind the logo. Because what you can't see in a logo is the powerful race equity work that we were doing at exactly the same time. You see, the race equity work group at Every Texan, which was developed and led by our staff, had been pushing for years to center race equity in our work. But for some reason over the years, despite many meetings and trainings, we simply weren't gaining the muscle memory that we needed to truly achieve our objective. I see a lot of heads nodding, so I know that you're familiar with this. Now, fortunately, the work group, which today is led by Rachel Cooper, realized that we had to look inward. We needed to look in the mirror. We had some internal barriers that we had to address first. And so in 2019, same year as the rebrand, the work group created a roadmap to hurdle those barriers. They forced the conversation. They were relentless. And so when I came on board as a new CEO about 7 months ago, as a lawyer, I conducted interviews and I reviewed documents and I looked at surveys. And what I concluded was that the entire staff, without exception, believed that what we were missing was a collective definition of race equity and buy-in. And that was something that was holding us back. So we put our money where our mouth was. We made race equity a line item in the budget. We gave stipends to the work group. And we hired some outside consultants to help support the work group to chart that path to a collective definition and an internal policy that would help us operationalize race equity across the organization, right down to onboarding new board members. Now, we really raised some eyebrows when we hired consultants to do this work. After all, we're progressives in Texas. Shouldn't we be the experts in leading this work? And as a nonprofit, can we really afford to be using our limited resources to hire help? In our case, the answer was yes and yes. We had gone through a pandemic, multiple brutal legislative sessions, and the worst snowstorm that Texas had ever seen. Frankly, we were exhausted, and we needed that fresh perspective, that outside eye, to help us sequence the work and get to the next level. And so the lesson here is, if you need to develop muscles, you might need to invest in a personal trainer. You're still doing the work, but it doesn't hurt to help someone on the outside holding you accountable. Another thing you can't see behind the logo, establishing a sector-shifting union. That's definitely something you can't see in a brand. That's right. Let me explain. In late 2019, again, same year as the rebrand, our staff sent a letter to management informing management that they had created a staff union and were seeking voluntary recognition. Every Texan voluntarily recognized the union the following year. And management and union staff alike underwent over 18 months of collective bargaining, often stalled and even delayed by the pandemic and our legislative sessions. Now, unlike our race equity work, collective bargaining is inherently adversarial, and my predecessors bore the brunt of that work. We actually adopted our first union contract 3 months after my first day at the organization. But I did have the opportunity to learn and observe, and I want to share a few thoughts with leaders who might fear unions. First, unions are an opportunity to live your values at home. And what I mean by that is creating a worker-friendly environment at home while you advocate for the same statewide. The collective bargaining agreement was also a ready-made communications tool, which for me as a new organizational leader was a godsend. I have a labor management committee created by the contract made up of equal numbers of management and staff that provides insight and weighs in on major decisions that might impact staff. There are established processes for communication that eliminate favoritism and help foster a sense of transparency and trust. Just because the process is adversarial doesn't mean that the contentiousness has to be a bad thing. There don't have to be winners and losers. And that might sound like a strange thing coming from me, because you might think as a lawyer, I think everything's about winning and losing. But the fact of the matter is that in a world where over 80% of nonprofits are white-led, and as the first person of color to lead this organization in its 36-year history, the collective bargaining agreement not only leveled the playing field for my staff, it leveled the playing field for me. I was able to make major personnel investments in my first proposed budget to the board without fear of rejection or accusations of overreach. And we're talking about base salary pay, a student loan repayment program, new hires to address capacity, just to name a few. And so the lesson here is that union contracts are tools, not hindrances for leaders. I should also mention that during all of this deep, powerful internal work, every Texan was also getting the job done, earning major policy wins in one of the reddest states in the country. We brought home pandemic relief checks for teachers. We formed a statewide coalition that earned bills that addressed food security and ended hunger. We repeatedly fought back against a bill that would have prevented counties and cities from enhancing workplace conditions for frontline workers. This is Texas, y'all. We beat back the doubling of small dollar consumer loans. We repeatedly beat back regressive property tax cuts. Our experts provided testimony over 60 times. We engaged almost 15,000 Texans in campaign advocacy. We generated over 1.1 million social media impressions. I mean, not to brag, but in the words of Beyonce, we flawless. One of our greatest victories was Chapter 313, the eradication of a corporate tax incentive program that would have leached billions of dollars away from Texas public schools over the course of a decade. Now, political experts on both sides of the aisle sort of scoffed at us when we said that we were going to take this on. But our Deputy Legislative Director, Mia Ibarra, and our seasoned rock star political icon, fiscal analyst, Dick Levine, saw the path. And we forged an unlikely alliance with TPPF, the Texas Public Policy Foundation. They're not the organization who shall not be named. And this is an organization that is hyper-conservative, sort of arch nemesis, counterpart of every Texan. But together we formed a coalition, and we brought down this corporate tax incentive program that we affectionately called corporate welfare. And we shocked the political world when we swept 313 out like a rug from underneath the feet of state leaders. And it just goes to show that when the dark side and the Jedi stand together, anything can happen. And that's the takeaway, right? Don't back down from a fight. Nothing's predestined. There's a reason that we show up for the work that we do day after day. It's because we can win. So in review, yes, there was a rebrand, but there was also powerful race equity work. There was the establishment of a sector-shifting union, scoring major policy wins, and we did it all in COVID and snowvid and multiple legislative sessions and a national identity crisis and an election cycle and a major leadership transition. I mean, when I think about it all, I kind of have to take a step and take a breath. I mean, man, we're badasses. But in all seriousness, I want to speak to my staff and say to my staff that I'm just so proud of how we've all come together through this, and I can't wait to work alongside you in the coming year. Some final thoughts and reflection on what a rebrand can mean for a leader. In my former life, I was a civil rights lawyer. I was a litigator for almost 10 years. And my entire world was binary. Wins or losses, good or bad, friend or foe. In fact, my world was so binary that when I first joined Every Texan and they asked me about my pronouns for my business card, I had to Google it. Fluidity was just not part of the world that I lived in and the world that I operated in. But I quickly learned that what served me so well before was no longer going to serve me or my team. That I had to rethink myself, that I had to rethink how I approach things, and in many ways, I needed a new brand of leadership. Now, in my old world, every case, the goal was a final judgment, and every day I had to constantly drive my team towards that outcome. But in this world, I realized that heavy work like race equity and a rebrand is not so linear, and that sometimes the most important work must be ongoing. It must be unending. And conflict is sometimes a good thing because it presents an opportunity for evolution and growth. So if you take nothing away from this talk, except one thing, I hope it's this, that a rebrand is much more than a logo. It's an evolution. It's growth. It's an opportunity for constant rethinking, not just on how we do things, but why. And if you do it right, a rebrand represents that opportunity for your organization and maybe even for its leader. Thank you.